You know a neighborhood's gone too far when even your dreams need board approval. Whispering Pines, a suburb so polished it could double as a car commercial, had one unspoken rule: conform or perish. The lawns were greener than reality allowed, the mailboxes stood in eerie synchronization, and the only thing louder than the sprinklers was the judgment radiating from the HOA president's khaki shorts. His name? Preston Ainsworth III. The third wasn't a suffix, it was a warning label. Mark, our unsuspecting hero, wasn't trying to stage a revolution. He just wanted a shed, a humble wooden sanctuary for tinkering with his vintage electronics, his keyboards, his soldering irons, and maybe a bit of peace away from his wife's growing concern that their garage was turning into a scrapyard sponsored by Radio Shack. To Mark, this wasn't clutter. It was a cathedral of creativity. To Sarah, it was a tetanus-themed art exhibit. But before he could even buy the lumber, the HOA swooped in like a beige SWAT team. A letter arrived, crisp, cream-colored, heavy enough to block out sunlight. The HOA logo shimmered in gold foil like it was a luxury brand of tyranny. Mark opened it with the confidence of a man expecting maybe a note about trash cans. Instead, it was a declaration of war. Effective immediately, it read in righteous Times New Roman, the construction or placement of any sheds, outbuildings, or auxiliary structures is hereby prohibited. In short, no sheds, no hope, no sanity. For a moment, silence filled the kitchen. Sarah blinked. Mark reread the letter like it might suddenly start making sense. $100 per day fine for any unapproved structure. That's right, $100 daily to dream about storage. Mark's jaw tightened. You could see the fuse light behind his eyes. This wasn't just a rule, it was personal. Preston had struck preemptively, blocking Mark's project before it even existed. Somewhere, probably behind a hedge, Preston was smiling, the smug smile of a man who thinks beige is a personality. But Mark wasn't going to fold his blueprint and walk away. Oh, no. He crumpled the letter, raised his coffee mug like a battle flag, and declared to the gods of suburbia, "This means war." Sarah sighed, knowing that tone. The last time he'd said those words, he ended up rewiring the entire home theater system at 2 a.m. for better surround sound. This was about to get louder and a lot more expensive. The HOA may have banned sheds, but they hadn't banned ambition or spite. And Mark had both in industrial quantities. He just needed a plan, one that would make Preston regret ever underestimating the power of one man, one dream, and an unreasonable amount of DIY determination. Because if the HOA thought banning sheds would end the story, they hadn't met a man willing to read the fine print like it was scripture and find the kind of loophole you could drive a shipping container through. If you ever want to witness true madness, hand a suburban dad a rule book and tell him he can't build something. Within 24 hours, he'll transform into a legal scholar, civil engineer, and part-time revolutionary. That was Mark. The moment the HOA slammed the door on sheds, he didn't sulk. He sharpened his highlighter. You could almost hear the Mission Impossible theme playing as he sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by bylaws, coffee mugs, and righteous fury. Now, the HOA rulebook wasn't exactly light reading. It was 200 pages of weaponized boredom, filled with phrases like aesthetic uniformity and community visual harmony, the kind of language that makes you want to file a complaint about oxygen. But to Mark, it was treasure. Somewhere inside this bureaucratic labyrinth, he knew there had to be a way to win. And then he found it. There it was, buried deep under a section so dull even Preston probably skimmed it, the definition of a permanent structure. According to the bylaws, a permanent structure was anything affixed to a concrete foundation or slab. That's it. Nothing about temporary structures, nothing about industrial containers, nothing about 40-foot metal monuments of defiance. Mark grinned like a man who just found the Konami code of suburban warfare. He read the line again and again, just to be sure. Permanent was the magic word, and suddenly his dream of a shed began mutating into something bigger, stronger, steelier. His mind raced through possibilities. Tent? Too flimsy. Mobile home? Too obvious. Then the algorithm of destiny intervened. As he scrolled online, an ad appeared. Heavy-duty storage solutions, used shipping containers for sale. The photo showed a massive corrugated steel box basking in the sun like a metallic deity of defiance. His coffee went cold, but his purpose ignited. A normal man would have laughed and scrolled past. Mark? He opened a new tab labeled Shipping Container Workshop Ideas. Pinterest had no idea what was coming. The plan was insane, bold, beautiful. A shipping container wasn't a building, it was equipment. It had no foundation, no roof shingles, no visual harmony. It was, technically speaking, temporary. Sure, it weighed 4 tons and required a crane to move, but legal loopholes don't measure in pounds. They measure in audacity. He could already picture Preston's face, veins twitching that overwatered lawn sprinklers, as a 40-foot steel box rolled into the neighborhood. It wasn't against the rules, Preston. It was just aggressively compliant. Mark turned to Sarah with the confidence of a man about to do something incredibly stupid and make it look like genius. "Honey," he said, brandishing the rule book, "I found a loophole the size of Texas." Sarah gave him that look, the one that says, "You're either brilliant or about to end up on the evening news." "What kind of loophole?" she asked cautiously. "The kind," he said, "that comes with the crane." The HOA had drawn a line in the mulch. Mark had found a way to step clean over it, with steel-toed boots and a freight train full of mischief. Because when the HOA tells you no sheds, you don't say no, you say, "Cool, I'll just import one from the Port of Los Angeles." And oh boy, that freight train of rebellion was already on its way. Some people make online purchases they regret. Mark wasn't one of them. His add-to-cart moment was the kind of decision that separates ordinary men from legends. While other dads were scrolling for power drills or Bluetooth lawnmowers, Mark clicked "Buy Now" on 40 feet of industrial-grade steel rebellion, a used shipping container that once ferried electronics across the Pacific. Now it was coming to Whispering Pines to deliver justice. The confirmation email was glorious. "Your intermodal steel building unit will be delivered within 7 to 10 business days." Even the description sounded smugly poetic. Intermodal, steel, building unit. The HOA's nightmares were officially in transit. Mark read it 3 times, then whispered to himself, "They can't find what they can't define." 10 days later, tranquility shattered. The peaceful hum of lawnmowers was replaced by a mechanical roar so loud even the squirrels filed noise complaints. Kids ran to the sidewalks, curtains twitched open. It was delivery day. The truck arrived like a beast, a 16-wheeler dragging 40 feet of dented defiance through streets designed for minivans and mail trucks. The driver, Gus, looked like he'd wrestled diesel engines for sport. His assistant, Kyle, wore a t-shirt that read, "I'm with the crane." Perfect. "Mark?" Gus grunted, scanning his clipboard. "That's me," Mark said, trying to sound casual, like people parked freight containers in their yards every day. "Where do you want her?" "Backyard," Mark said, confidently pointing toward the narrow 5-foot gate between his house and the fence. Gus followed his finger. Then he looked back at the container. Then at Mark. He stopped chewing his toothpick. "You're kidding." "Nope." "Son," Gus sighed, "the only way this thing's getting in there is divine intervention or a 100-ton crane." Mark's grin didn't falter. "Then call the crane." That's when Mark realized something profound. You can't wage a suburban war without creating a spectacle. But next week, 2 trucks returned. One carried the container, the other, a hydraulic crane the size of a small apocalypse. The entire neighborhood assembled like it was parade day. Dave brought popcorn, kids sat cross-legged on driveways, even Sarah filmed from the porch, muttering, "Well, at least it'll go viral." And then, the moment. The crane unfurled with mechanical grace, cables gleaming in the sun. Gus maneuvered it like a maestro, while Kyle occasionally got tangled in the guide ropes like interpretive art. The container lifted from the flatbed, rising majestically over rooftops. Gasps filled the cul-de-sac. It swung, creaking, a floating symbol of defiance. Across the street, Preston Answorth III stood in full HOA regalia, pastel polo, clipboard, and pure fury. His jaw locked, his face blossomed to a shade of magenta known only to rage and overcooked shrimp. With a deep, metallic thud, the container landed in Mark's backyard, shaking the ground and the HOA's authority at once. Mark walked over, patted its corrugated steel side, and said the line that would echo through suburban legend. "This isn't a shed, Preston. It's a temporary, relocatable storage unit, completely legal." Preston's eye twitched, he sputtered, he threatened bylaws, fines, and emergency meetings. But the truth was undeniable. The rulebook had nothing on this. The steel monolith stood tall, smud, and gloriously out of place. The ward had a new front line, and it was made of rust. As Gus packed up, Dave raised his beer can in salute, saying, "That's one hell of a shed, Mark." Mark grinned. "Correction, it's not a shed, it's freedom." But freedom, as it turns out, isn't always pretty, because when the dust settled and the crane left, Mark realized he hadn't just outsmarted the HOA. He'd also parked a 40-foot industrial eyesore right in the middle of suburbia. And oh, it was about to get ugly. When the crane finally rumbled off into the sunset, the neighborhood was left staring at what could only be described as a suburban UFO crash site. There it was, Mark's glorious rebellion, 40 feet of industrial beige squatting in the middle of his perfectly manicured backyard like a depressed whale that gave up on migrating. The paint was peeling, the corners rusted, and the color, oh, the color, looked like sadness had been left out in the rain. Sarah stood at the window, coffee in hand, expression somewhere between awe and despair. "It's big," she said slowly. "Majestic," Mark replied, his voice wobbling somewhere between pride and denial. "Mark," she said flatly, "it looks like sadness. A rectangular sadness." She wasn't wrong. From the kitchen window, it blocked the sunrise, the garden, and possibly all hope. The neighbors whispered, Preston seethed. Dave laughed so hard he nearly fell off his writing mower. The HOA meeting that week must have been electric. Whispers of industrial contamination and aesthetic trauma echoing through beige walls. Mark knew he had to fix it, not just for himself, but for the honor of all free men who dared dream of a place to store their junk. He stared at the giant box, gears turning in his head. This wasn't a defeat. This was a canvas. The way some men see problems, visionaries see opportunity. And Mark, fueled by caffeine, spite, and the ghost of Bob Ross, decided to transform the container from eyesore to art. He burst into the living room with the kind of energy usually reserved for cult leaders and startup founders. "Sarah," he said dramatically, "we're going to paint it." She blinked. Paints it what, exactly? A landscape, a Bob Ross landscape, with happy little trees, mighty mountains, and maybe a peaceful lake that reflects my defiance. Silence. Then a slow smile crept across Sarah's face, the smile of a woman who knew this was completely unhinged, but somehow gloriously right. "You want to fight the HOA with art?" Exactly, Mark said. We'll weaponize serenity. The next morning, they loaded up their car with gallons of exterior paint, brushes, rollers, and enough optimism to power a small city. At the hardware store, Mark debated between Arctic sky and tranquil blue, like a man choosing between battle flags. The integrity of the lake depends on this decision, he muttered. The clerk stared blankly. By the time they returned, the backyard had turned into a war zone of color. They set up a laptop on the patio, queued up an episode of The Joy of Painting, and got to work. The corrugated steel fought back. Every groove rejected their brushstrokes like it had HOA membership of its own. Mark's mountain looked like a gray blob melting under nuclear fallout. Sarah's clouds resembled angry cotton balls mid-riot. And yet, it was magnificent. Each mistake became a happy accident, each misstep another brushstroke in the gospel of defiance. They laughed, cursed, painted, and bonded. By the time the sun went down, the industrial monster had transformed into something beautiful, or at least beautifully absurd. Now, instead of an eyesore, Preston had to stare at a massive, vibrant mural of peace and joy every morning. It was poetic justice in acrylic form. Mark called it Operation Happy Little Accident. Sarah called it the dumbest, most brilliant thing we've ever done. And the best part? Even the HOA couldn't find him for beauty. But while Mark was out there painting his masterpiece of rebellion, Preston was quietly mixing a new color, the beige of vengeance. Because the HOA wasn't about to let happy little trees grow unchecked. The war was far from over, and the next strike would come through the mailbox. By Saturday morning, the battle lines of color had been drawn, literally. Mark's backyard looked like an art school exploded behind a Lowe's. The smell of paint filled the air, the brushes dripped with defiance, and the corrugated steel walls of the shipping container gleamed under a thin coat of primer that screamed, "I dare you to find me for joy." As the morning sun rose, something unexpected started happening. One by one, neighbors wandered over. At first, they came out of pure curiosity. After all, you don't see a suburban homeowner power washing a 40-foot metal box while muttering Bob Ross quotes very often. But curiosity turned into fascination. Mrs. Gable, the sweet old lady who'd once been denied her orchid greenhouse, brought a pitcher of lemonade and declared, "I always liked art." Dave showed up with folding chairs and a six-pack, announcing, "This is the best HOA meeting I've ever attended." It didn't take long for the project to become the neighborhood event. Sarah painted soft, fluffy clouds, while Mark tackled the almighty mountain, which looked increasingly like a lopsided volcano, but had character. And in Whispering Pines, character was a crime worth committing. Kids gathered on the grass, offering unsolicited art critiques. "You should add a dragon," one shouted, "or a UFO," another said. Mark nodded seriously. "Maybe next season," he replied, as if planning a sequel. Even skeptics couldn't resist the absurd charm of it all. The rhythmic clack of rollers and brushes filled the air like suburban percussion. With each stroke, Mark's ridiculous rebellion transformed into something strangely unifying. The HOA wanted a harmonious visual landscape. Well, this was it, just not the way they'd envisioned. From the deck next door, Preston stood motionless, arms crossed, staring at the slow-motion apocalypse unfolding before him. His face was that of a man witnessing civilization crumble, or worse, someone realizing his own rules had been outsmarted by acrylic paint. Behind him, his wife whispered something that sounded suspiciously like, "It's actually kind of pretty." That, of course, only deepened his existential crisis. By Sunday evening, the container had been reborn. 40 feet of steel, now wrapped in a chaotic symphony of blues, greens, and whites. Sure, the perspective was off and the lake defied the laws of gravity, but it didn't matter. Against all odds, it looked peaceful, joyful even. And that's when the shift happened. Whispering Pines had never looked more alive. People stopped pretending not to make eye contact on their morning walks. They smiled, pointed, even laughed. For the first time, the neighborhood wasn't just a collection of manicured lawns, it was a community. Mark's ridiculous art project had done what 1,000 HOA meetings never could. It made people talk to each other. That night, under patio lights and the soft smell of drying paint, Sarah looked at Mark and said, "You realize we've started a movement, right?" Mark grinned, beer in hand. "Yeah, a movement of happy little trees." He didn't know it yet, but those trees, crooked and charming, had become a rallying flag for everyone tired of Preston's pastel tyranny. The HOA had painted itself into a corner, and Mark had painted right over it. But every masterpiece has a critic. And in this story, that critic came armed with fines, forms, and fury. Because if Mark's art was rebellion, then Preston's next move was retaliation, one envelope at a time. Every revolution has a counterstrike. And in Whispering Pines, retaliation doesn't come with tanks or sirens. It comes with envelopes. Crisp, cream-colored, gold-embossed, and full of venom. The first one arrived Monday morning, tucked neatly between a grocery flyer and a pizza coupon, as if evil could hide behind 2-for-1 pepperoni deals. Mark tore it open over breakfast, knowing exactly who it was from before he even saw the letterhead. "Violation notice," it began, with all the warmth of a parking ticket. "Unapproved external structure. $100 fine. Due immediately." Sarah read over his shoulder. "That's cute," she said dryly. "You should frame it." But it didn't stop there. The next day, another envelope, then another. By the end of the week, their mailbox looked like a bureaucrat's piñata. Each letter came with the same sanctimonious phrasing: aesthetic disharmony, visual disruption, community cohesion threat. Mark read them aloud in his best announcer voice, transforming HOA tyranny into performance art. Preston had clearly gone nuclear. If he couldn't remove the freedom box by rule, he'd try to bury Mark in paperwork. But Mark wasn't the type to be buried quietly. Oh no. For every fine that arrived, he fired back a letter of his own, an appeal. And not just a quick, "I disagree." No, these were masterpieces of sarcasm and precision. "Dear Mr. Ainsworth and esteemed board, thank you for your concern regarding the aesthetic disharmony of Whispering Pines. Please note that my structure has been enhanced by a hand-painted, tranquil Bob Ross-style mural. I argue that this addition contributes positively to the neighborhood's serenity. Attached, photographic exhibit A, happy little trees." Even Sarah had to admit it was poetic. Every time Mark sealed another envelope, it felt like dropping a glitter bomb into Preston's inbox. Dave, of course, was loving every minute of it. "You're like the Gandhi of paint, if Gandhi had a paint roller and no impulse control." But as the fines piled up, so did the tension. Preston wasn't just angry. He was obsessed. His crusade for visual harmony had turned personal. Word spread fast through the neighborhood. Some people sided with Preston, muttering about property values like they were sacred scripture, but most loved it. They started calling the container the Bob Ross Freedom Box. Kids drew little mountains in chalk on the sidewalk. Mrs. Gable even crocheted a miniature version for her porch. The HOA's iron grip was slipping, one happy little tree at a time. Still, Preston doubled down. He sent daily fines, sometimes 2 at once, as if sheer volume could force surrender. $100, $200, $900. The pile grew, an ivory tower of absurdity. Sarah finally asked the question both of them were thinking. How long can this go on? Mark leans back in his chair, surrounded by the paperwork of war, and smirked. As long as it takes for him to realize that the only thing uglier than my container is his temper. But Preston wasn't out of tricks yet. The HOA Supreme Commander was about to deploy his final weapon. Something that could only mean one thing. Because when passive-aggressive letters fail and your rulebook starts to crumble, there's only one last line of defense for an HOA dictator. Call the police. And trust me, even the police weren't ready for what they were about to see.
When you've been outmaneuvered, outpainted, and publicly humiliated by a 40-foot steel Bob Ross mural, there's really only one thing left to do: call the police. And that's exactly what Preston Ainsworth III did, because in his mind, there had to be some law, somewhere, that could stop Mark's monstrosity. Unfortunately for Preston, the universe had other plans and a great sense of humor. It was a peaceful afternoon. Mark was inside his newly christened Freedom Box, reorganizing his workbench and humming along to a mixtape of 80s rock. He was in his element, surrounded by soldering irons, circuit boards, and the faint smell of victory. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps against the steel door that echoed like destiny wearing mirrored sunglasses. "Mark!" Sarah's voice was tense. "You need to come outside. There's a police car in our driveway." He froze mid-solder. Police? For what? Painting without a permit? Industrial joy-walking? He set his tools down and stepped outside, blinking in the sun. And there it was, a black and white cruiser parked neatly at the curb, lights off, engine idling, like a harbinger of absurdity. 2 officers stood by the mailbox, one older, world-weary, mustache drooping like a disappointed parent, the other younger, fighting back a grin he couldn't quite hide. "Afternoon, officers," Mark said calmly, trying to look as innocent as someone can while standing next to a giant, illegal-looking container covered in cheerful clouds. "Something wrong?" The older one sighed, a long, exhausted sound that carried the weight of every ridiculous 911 call ever made. "Sir, we received a report of an unlicensed industrial operation being run from this address." Mark blinked. "An industrial operation?" "That's what your neighbor claimed," the officer said, glancing toward Preston's house. And right on cue, there he was, Preston, arms crossed, chest puffed, strutting across the lawn like he was leading the HOA's version of a SWAT raid. "Officers," Preston barked, his voice cracking with indignation, "this man is in violation of multiple neighborhood covenants and city codes. That thing," he pointed dramatically at the mural, "is a blight upon our community." The younger cop, Officer Davis, looked up at the 40-foot masterpiece. His lips twitched. "Sir, is that a mountain?" "Indeed it is," Mark said proudly. "A collaborative depiction of nature's tranquility, featuring several happy little trees. Would you like a tour?" Officer Davis coughed, the universal code for "I'm laughing, but I shouldn't be." Officer Miller, the mustache veteran, pinched the bridge of his nose. "Mr. Ainsworth," he said, his patience hanging by a thread, "this is not a police matter." "Oh, but it is," Preston sputtered. "This man is corrupting the aesthetic harmony of Whispering Pines." That's when Miller dropped the line that would become HOA legend. "Sir, a happy little cloud you don't like does not constitute an emergency." Silence. Pure, glorious silence. Officer Davis completely lost it, snorting laughter so hard he had to turn away and pretend to examine a bush. Preston's face turned the color of expired ham. His moral authority? Vaporized. His dignity? Evaporated. His control? Gone with the breeze. The officers left, Miller muttering something about suburban nonsense, and Davis shooting Mark a subtle thumbs up as he walked past. "Nice work on the evergreen," he whispered. The police car rolled away, leaving Preston standing alone, a defeated dictator without a cause. The neighborhood had witnessed it all, and within hours, every group chat in Whispering Pines was lit up like a 4th of July barbecue. Did you hear Preston called the cops over a painting? Preston had wanted to bring the law down on Mark's head. Instead, he just made him a legend. But if Preston thought the cops' laughter was the end of the story, he was wrong, because Mark was about to uncover a secret buried deep in the HOA's history, a document so powerful it would flip the entire war upside down.
After the police incident, the HOA battlefield went eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't mean peace, but plotting. Preston had retreated to his pastel fortress, licking his bureaucratic wounds, while Mark sipped victory coffee in his backyard, admiring the mural that now glowed proudly under the sun. But somewhere between the caffeine buzz and the satisfaction of public humiliation, Mark realized something. The fines were still coming. Every week, another envelope. Every envelope, another $100. Preston might have lost face, but he was still wielding his only weapon, the HOA rulebook, that thick, soul-sucking tome that could turn any joy into paperwork. So Mark did what any self-respecting suburban rebel would do. He decided to weaponize it right back. He sat at his kitchen table one evening, surrounded by stacks of bylaws, board minutes, and coffee-stained Post-it notes. His eyes scanned every paragraph, every clause, every parenthesis. Hours passed. Midnight turned into 2 a.m., and Sarah walked in, groggy. "You still reading that thing?" "I'm close," he muttered. "There's something here. I can feel it." And then he found it. Buried in Section 14, Article 9, any pre-existing or temporary structure used for personal storage shall be exempt from aesthetic review until a formal amendment is adopted by a majority homeowner vote. Mark froze. His brain replayed the words like a divine soundtrack. Exempt from aesthetic review? Translation: the HOA couldn't legally fine him unless they changed the bylaws, and they hadn't. Preston's entire crusade was built on a technical mirage. All this time, every fine, every threat, every pompous email, completely invalid. He double-checked, triple-checked, even called his lawyer friend who confirmed it with giddy disbelief. "Mark," the lawyer said between laughs, "you're basically HOA untouchable. That container is the Fort Knox of loopholes." Mark's grin stretched wider than the neighborhood's speed bumps. The next morning, he printed out the clause, framed it, and hung it right on the container door in bold type. Then, for good measure, he titled it Freedom Clause. When Preston saw it, something inside him audibly snapped. The vein in his temple started doing Morse code. This is nonsense," he sputtered, waving his clipboard like an ancient scroll of authority. Mark, calm as a Zen master in steel-toed boots, pointed to the printed rule. "Not nonsense, Preston. Section 14, Article 9. Straight from your own rulebook." Sarah watched from the porch, sipping tea. Dave, ever the commentator, muttered to himself, "And that's what we call a plot twist, folks." The news spread faster than gossip at a yard sale. By evening, half the neighborhood had screenshots of the clause. Mrs. Gable crocheted Section 14 into a throw pillow. The HOA group chat went into meltdown, people demanding meetings, others laughing emojis into oblivion. Mark had done it. He hadn't just beaten Preston, he'd beaten the entire system. Preston, cornered by his own paperwork, did the only thing a defeated tyrant could do. He called for an emergency HOA meeting. Rumor had it he was planning a new amendment, one that could change the rules retroactively, a desperate last-ditch grab for power. Mark smiled. He was ready. If the HOA wanted a war of amendments, he had something better, an army of amused neighbors who were suddenly very, very tired of beige tyranny. Because when the system you built turns against you, there's only one thing left to fear: democracy. And in Whispering Pines, democracy was about to get loud. When Preston called the emergency HOA meeting, he pictured a solemn gathering of loyal followers ready to restore suburban order. What he got instead was a full-blown neighborhood rebellion disguised as a potluck. Folding chairs filled the community center. The air buzzed with tension, gossip, and the faint smell of deviled eggs. Everyone was there, from the retired couples clutching Tupperware to Dave, proudly wearing a t-shirt that read, "Team Bob Ross." Preston banged his gavel, yes, an actual gavel, against the table, trying to project authority he no longer possessed. "Order," he barked. "Order, please." But nobody was listening. Someone in the back yelled, "Order a pizza instead," and the room erupted in laughter. Mark sat in the second row, arms crossed, the calm eye of the storm. He wasn't there to fight. He was there to witness history, the fall of an HOA empire built on control, fear, and pastel-approved conformity. Preston, red-faced and trembling, launched into his speech. "Ladies and gentlemen of Whispering Pines, our once beautiful neighborhood has been defaced. We must vote on a bylaw amendment effective immediately, banning all shipping containers, painted or otherwise, from our properties." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Gable stood up, shawl fluttering like the flag of the Revolution. "Preston," she said sweetly, "you've been president for 15 years, and I still can't put a wind chime on my porch without you sending a letter. Maybe it's time for some happy little changes." Applause broke out. Actual applause. The kind that doesn't stop when you want it to. Preston's face twisted. "This isn't a popularity contest." Dave shouted from the back. "Sure looks like you're losing one, though." Mark leaned forward, voice steady, slicing through the chaos. "Let's be honest here. The HOA was supposed to protect property values, not crush creativity. We all pay dues. We all follow rules. But when the rules stop making sense, who are they really serving?" A collective nod spread across the room. Neighbors who'd once whispered complaints in secret now spoke up. One man mentioned being fined for improper shade of beige. Another woman brought photos of her daughter's playhouse that the HOA ordered torn down. It was like watching years of pent-up frustration pour out in glorious technicolor. Preston's control evaporated faster than fertilizer in July heat. "This is mutiny," he cried. "No, Preston," Sarah called out from the side, arms crossed with quiet authority. "This is democracy." And with that, the vote began. The motion on the table: remove Preston as HOA president and dissolve the pending amendment. Hands shot up. Half. Then 3/4. Then almost everyone. Only Preston and his trembling pen voted against. Gavel dropped. History made. Mark stood, not gloating, but grinning the way you do when you realize the universe finally caught up with karma. The crowd cheered. Dave chanted, "Long live the Freedom Box," and others joined in. It was absurd. It was beautiful. It was perfectly suburban. Preston, defeated, mumbled something about relocating to a stricter community and stormed out, his clipboard swinging like a limp sword. As the door slammed, laughter filled the room. Not cruel, just liberated. The HOA wasn't gone, but it was reborn. A new board was voted in on the spot. People who wanted fewer fines and more sanity. They promised fewer rules, more community events, and most importantly, that Mark's mural would remain untouched, protected as a symbol of neighborhood unity. Preston's beige reign was officially over. Whispering Pines had color now, literally and metaphorically. But every great story needs a finale, and Mark's wasn't done yet. Because after all the chaos, paint, and paperwork, he had one last surprise waiting for his neighbors. A celebration that would turn his act of rebellion into neighborhood legend. With Preston officially dethroned and the neighborhood buzzing with newfound freedom, Whispering Pines felt different. The air was lighter, the lawns looked a little less perfect, and somehow that was perfect. For the first time in forever, the community wasn't ruled by color codes and fear of fines. There were kids riding bikes without helmets that matched their mailboxes. Someone even planted pink flowers. Scandalous once upon a time. And in the middle of it all stood Mark's shipping container. No longer an eyesore, but a monument, a legend. The mural, once mocked as suburban graffiti, had become a landmark. People stopped on walks to take selfies with the Freedom Box. Kids used it as a backdrop for lemonade stands. Even Mrs. Gable held her book club meetings under its painted trees, calling it therapy without the copay. But Mark wasn't done. Victory was sweet, sure, but he wanted to celebrate it properly. "We didn't just win," he told Sarah one night. "We started something. Let's make it official." Sarah squinted. "Official how?" Mark grinned. "By hosting the first ever festival of happy little trees." The next few weeks were chaos, the good kind. Flyers went up around the block, hand-painted and full of color. "Bring your brushes, bring your art, bring your rebellion," it read. Dave volunteered to man the grill, which everyone agreed was risky, but worth it. Mrs. Gable offered her famous lemonade. Even the new HOA president, a kind retiree named Barbara with a sense of humor, approved the event with one line: "As long as nobody paints me, go for it." When the big day arrived, the cul-de-sac transformed into a carnival of color. Tarps lined the sidewalks, paint cans glistened in the sun. Neighbors, kids, and even curious visitors from other communities showed up, armed with brushes, stencils, and imagination. Someone even brought a karaoke machine. Someone else brought a Bob Ross wig. And there, at the center of it all, Mark stood beside his shipping container, microphone in hand. "Welcome, everyone," he said, voice booming through the speakers. "A year ago, this was just a big, ugly box. Today, it's proof that a little color and a lot of stubbornness can change everything. So grab a brush. Let's make Whispering Pines weird again." The crowd roared. Paint splashed. Music blared. By midday, every fence, planter box, and mailbox in sight had some form of artistic expression on it. Waves, birds, sunflowers, even a portrait of Preston's scowling face wearing clown makeup, courtesy of Dave. It was glorious. The HOA rules never stood a chance against that much laughter. Reporters showed up. The story hit local news. Neighborhood turns HOA rebellion into art festival. Mark became a folk hero overnight, the man who defied beige tyranny and replaced it with rainbows and joy. Even the mayor stopped by, declaring it the most creative zoning dispute in city history. As the sun set, the festival lights flickered on. The shipping container glowed like a beacon of victory. Sarah leaned on Mark's shoulder and said softly, "You know, you could have just built a smaller garage." Mark smiled. "Yeah, but where's the fun in that?" Fireworks cracked in the sky, the reflection dancing off the painted mountains and trees. The whole neighborhood cheered, united not by rules, but by ridiculous, beautiful freedom. In the end, Mark didn't just beat the HOA. He reminded everyone that homes aren't meant to look identical. They're meant to feel alive. And as the final firework fizzled into a cloud of glittering smoke, Dave raised his beer and shouted what will become the unofficial motto of Whispering Pines: "Long live the happy little trees." So, if you ever find yourself staring down a petty HOA letter telling you what you can't do, just remember Mark, his shipping container, and his paintbrush. Because sometimes the best way to win the war is to make it a masterpiece.